Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Theology Talk here at Thoughtful Faith. This is a show where we explore both our own theology in the restored church and also the theology and worldview of others. I'm your host, Jacob Hansen, and joining me today is my co-host, Hayden Carroll.
Hello, good to be here.
Also joining us is our special guest today, Troy Leavitt. Troy, welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, very happy to. I want to start off just by giving you the floor so that you can introduce yourself a bit to the audience.
All right, thanks, Jacob. So probably a good way to start out is, I'm a former Mormon myself, right? Formerly LDS. I served my mission to Busan, Korea from 1988 to 1990. I got married in the Las Vegas Temple in 1990, and then began my faith crisis that we all seem to have around 1992. So that puts me quite a ways back. I didn't resign from the church until 1999. And so all this stuff now with the modern ex-Mormon movement, I didn't see. There was no internet at the time. And, there's this saying about, you leave the church, but you can't leave it alone. Well, I'm a guy who left the church and completely left it alone. I left the church in the 90s. And even though most of my family is still LDS, I really didn't have much interaction with it. But this was driven home to me recently when I was having a discussion with my father, who has been a bishop and, like 10 years on high council. About 18 months ago, we were talking about the church, and this is when I was getting getting my interest back in the church because of things that was going on with them. And I made a comment about, Thomas S. Monson being the prophet, and he was like, "Oh, Russell Nelson's been the prophet for quite some time now." And I was like, "Oh my goodness, I have been out of the church so long that I had lost track of what was going on, even within it." So I'm one of those guys. But then I came back, and when I came back, I discovered this flourishing environment of all sorts of discussion about LDS theology that when I left the church in the early 90s and stuff would have been verboten, right? You couldn't have talked about most of these things back then without getting yourself into quite a lot of trouble. And now I see you guys being very open and willing to discuss these theological issues that in the 90s, I think would have got us in trouble. So I got very interested in it. And from that, I watched you guys on Midnight Mormons, which I think is a great show. I love those guys. I really enjoy what they're representing there. And you guys were talking a bit about positions of atheism. And even though I don't really like the label atheist, I do think it kind of fits me. And so I made some comments in there where I was critical of some of the stuff that you guys were saying from the perspective of, I think there's more to this atheistic worldview, especially as it relates to morality, than you guys are giving it credit. And so I commented, and you guys then in the next video called me out for making the comment. And I'm like, well, if you're going to call me out on the video, I might as well just be on the show. So
yeah, no, and we're happy to have you on. Honestly, that's what I want to do. If people engage seriously, and I thought your comments were actually quite good, even though I may have disagreed with them. I thought that they were thoughtful comments, and I enjoy interacting with people, even if they disagree with me, as long as they're thoughtful and they're actually like seriously engaging. Then I like serious engagement. If someone engages in a non-serious way, then sometimes I'll respond in a non-serious way. So that's just how that goes. Now you have a YouTube channel yourself. Tell me a little bit about
that. It's not active at all right now. I made it years ago. So I worked in the video game industry. I'm now retired, but there was a break after we had worked for Disney. After Disney shut down the Avalanche studio, the studio that's now making Hogwarts Legacy, right? Mm-hmm. The big Harry Potter game. The big Wizarding World game. So after they shut it down in 2016, I had some time and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. So I started making these videos, and the videos I was making was mostly about video games. Mm-hmm. But I was talking about, at that time, the introduction of social justice ideas that were coming in through the gaming press. And so I became a critic of social justice issues online. Then when I went back to work, back with Avalanche, it turns out 3 years later, after my YouTube channel was dead, the video gaming press decided that my old dead channel was so problematic that they called me out and wrote about 100 articles on me saying that, I was an anti-social justice YouTuber and kind of got in trouble with the woke mob. And I was under pressure at home already with things with the family that I mentioned earlier. And so with the combination of the woke mob coming after me and the stuff with the family, I just said, you know what, I'm going to go galt. I'm just going to bail out, right? So I retired. I just said, I'm out. I'll focus on the things with the family, which was the totally right choice to do. And the family stuff got better. But anyway, that's the story on my YouTube channel. It's still up, but it's very, very quiet. Like I haven't done anything for a long, long time. And I've kind of been deciding what to do. It did get up to about 30,000 subscribers, and some of my bigger videos were around 500,000 views. But the ones that I dealt with religion and stuff were somewhat smaller, right? So I did have several videos on there dealing with religion and morality and purpose and things like that because of my LDS background. But mostly the channel was video games. So that's
Very
that
cool.
story.
Well, I'm
people can
always,
go see it. You know,
I'm always happy to find and someone on the other side of the radical social justice thing and a fellow ally against that crew, because they're a little off the rails. But that's obviously a whole nother subject that we could probably get lost in for way too long. So to get us kind of into the content of what we were going to discuss today, you had brought up that you'd made some comments that we had kind of misrepresented some things when it came to sort of the atheistic view of morality. And I really wanted to take time today to sort of steel man, really, and for anyone who doesn't know what that means, the opposite of a straw man. Like I want to understand the best arguments for an atheistic sort of moral worldview. And so I guess to start out, I want to find out, when you talk about morality, just the term, like what is moral, or just the term morality, let's see if we can define that term first, just to make sure that we're talking about the same thing as we go here. So when you're thinking about morality and you're talking about morality, what do you mean by that? What are you talking about?
Okay, let me just frame this up so I don't scare any of your listeners, whatever. I should make it very clear. I'm not here to evangelize atheism, right? If you're a religious believer, that's cool. To me, the big litmus test of whether a religion is, in my opinion, moral or worthwhile is, does it encourage its adherents to be a better neighbor, right? And so that's my main thing. And I think, if an LDS person, and I think mostly the LDS church does encourage people to be better neighbors, then I don't really have an issue with it. So I kind of want to make sure that nobody's thinking I'm coming in here trying to convince you guys not to believe in something. I'm not doing that. Instead, I want to come in here and say, hey, as somebody who has kind of walked this path, who no longer believes in God, here is a way to approach morality that I think still fits within a rubric of being rational, but also still, compassionate and worthwhile, right? So I'm trying to say, here's an alternate way of viewing morality that doesn't rely upon a presupposition that God exists, right? So that's kind of my position. I'm not trying to evangelize. I'm trying to explain.
That's totally fine. So let's go into that. You want to discuss morality. So what do we mean by that? Like let's try and frame the concept of morality itself. How would you frame that?
So for me, morality is primarily how humans interact with other humans. It's the social laws or mores, or really it's just about how is it that we interact with one another to improve our well-being, as humans. So I don't see it as like something that exists as a light and dark throughout the whole universe. So I don't believe in concepts of good and evil that are eternal and absolute and exist everywhere, right? But I do think that within the smaller scale of being just humans on our little blue planet, we can have some guidelines as to how to better live with each other. And that is what morality deals with, is what are those guidelines? How do we figure those out? How do we make ourselves as humans have a better life on this planet? So I don't see it in a cosmic sense. I see it in a local sense, just for us.
So when you say figure it out, you don't mean discover them. You mean make them, right? Discover did you just call them laws? What did you just call them?
Like principles or guidelines. I don't believe that there's an absolute morality that you're basically discovering. Okay. But I do believe that there is a moral arc, right? That we as a species have gotten better and better at meeting the needs of humankind over time. And our moral principles that we've developed have been crucial in our flourishing as humanity. So I see it as this long arc of us getting better at this.
And you made a comment in one of your comments on the Midnight Mormon videos talking about how animals also have a moral framework. Could you talk about that for a second?
Yeah. So not so much a moral framework in the same way that humans do. What I'm talking about is moral sentiments, which is things like, as humans, we have these feelings like empathy and compassion, love, right? They're built into us, right? And you see these same things in other animals too. You see them in chimpanzees, you see it in elephants, you see it in dolphins, right? You see it in wolves. The social animals develop these emotions given to them primarily through natural selection, evolution, that improves the fitness of the pack, improves the fitness of the tribe in our case, right? And so these sentiments become part of who we are. They change our brains into responding to the things we see in the world in emotional ways, right? And that's where our moral or emotional sentiments come from.
So let me try and take what we've said so far and see if I can steel man it a little bit. So essentially what you're saying is that we as evolved creatures and as evolved animals, herd animals for that matter, have developed within us certain sentiments that we would call moral sentiments that help to guide our behavior towards higher levels of flourishing and higher levels of well-being, both individually and collectively as a group.
Right. And it's primarily, I would say that those sentiments that we developed very, very long ago when we were in tribal communities, right? Mm-hmm. So that a lot of it was based around, well, I feel love for my child, right? That would be oxytocin, right, in the brain that has been developed so that you get these bonding chemicals. And that then is their selective pressure on that if you care for your children, well, you'll have more offspring and more children, right? So there's a way to ratchet that up through these chemicals in your brain that evolution can act upon. And so we develop these sentiments of caring for one another within our own tribes, right? We also have developed very powerful anti-tribal sentiments too, right? We'll go to war with people who are not of the same tribe, right? But generally, all humans worldwide, all across the planet, Chinese, Indian, American, doesn't matter where we are, we share very similar sentiments. And those sentiments are what I would say are the universals from which we can start to build some sort of sense of morality or a groundwork from which we can build our civilization or have something. You guys refer to it as an objective morality. That's where I would say the objectiveness comes from, is that it's distributed by consensus throughout all of humankind.
So the basis of morality is ultimately rooted in human flourishing, because if something promotes human flourishing, then we would call that something morally good. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yes, that's the reasonable part of why it's there. But the emotions themselves are not necessarily reasonable, right? They're built right in. You have an immediate response to things. This is Hume. Hume talked about moral sentiments, right? That was his response to the is-ought problem about what should we do? We've got is that describes stuff, but we don't know what we ought to do. And so his explanation was, well, we have these built-in moral sentiments. When I see something, I immediately have a reaction to it about, I think that was a good thing, or that I think that was a bad thing. Like if I saw a little kid push another little kid, I might immediately go, that was bad. And there's an immediate response. And we're saying, or, the position is from evolutionary psychology is that was built in. You don't have to think about it. It's built in at an emotional level. So those moral sentiments.
What we're describing then, when I say that this is good, the reason I'm describing this thing as good is because it affects my moral sentiments in such a way that I have this rush of dopamine and other, serotonin or other chemicals that basically tell me this is beneficial to your survival. And therefore that thing is called a moral good because it increases my well-being, because those chemicals make you feel really, really good. And so that is a moral act, I guess, to some extent could be defined as the act that produces let's call it the buzz of sentiments that correspond with human thriving and flourishing.
I'd say that's, we're dealing with kind of big topics here, but yes, I'd say that's essentially it. That we get that little jolt or burst of dopamine for,
And
for doing something pleasurable, and that's built in by genes. Yeah.
And to boil that down, we would call that, and I oftentimes use this sort of language, right? I always say that morality is a description of a behavior's relationship to suffering, right? Because if a behavior causes suffering, we say that it's bad, right? Like there's no sense in saying that something is, and I mean that, and I oftentimes frame it this way. I say, it isn't just that it causes suffering, it's that it affects your ultimate like well-being, right? Because I may do something that causes me to suffer short term, but that's because it's going to produce a better outcome later. And that's the word we use for that is a sacrifice, right? If I make a sacrifice implies in the word that there is an outcome later on that's worth it. Because if I was just doing something that just like hurt me with no benefit, that wouldn't be called a sacrifice. That would just be called stupid. It would just be called like bad. Like you're just hurting yourself for no reason. There's no future state in which you get the payoff, right?
Right. For the most part, yeah.
But we can say sometimes that suffering does produce that it's a moral good to suffer if it produces a better outcome later, like more well-being down the road or something like that. Does that make sense?
Right. In a strictly like Darwinian sense, it wouldn't necessarily have to be your own genes. It could be the genes of those within your family or your kin, right? Because a gene selection would operate at that level. That, for example, you would most likely be willing to die for your children, right? Yeah. And you'd still be selecting for your own genes. And in fact, your emotional sentiments to do that, to stand up and protect your other genetic relatives is a advantage in a competitive world, right? So evolution would select for things like that. In other words, cooperation is a competitive advantage, right? Yeah.
Just to clarify and kind of steal mine, you help me understand this. It kind of sounds like to me that you almost are suggesting that there is an objective moral standard, but it comes from evolution, that we don't just decide it willy-nilly, but it's inherent in our genes. Am I hearing that correctly?
Essentially, yes. I'm saying the moral sentiments that we see around the world are, because they're distributed among humans and we see it everywhere, that we can say, okay, there's our objective standard that we can reach for. We can see and look around the world and say, hey, everybody kind of wants the same things, and when we look around the world at the different communities, whether it's Hindu or Chinese or whatever, you see the same sorts of laws pop up, right? They have the same things about, well, they don't want incest, they don't want murder, they don't want false accusation, all the things in the 10 Commandments that we see in the Christian or the Abrahamic tradition, you see in these other traditions too, just written a little differently. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And my suggestion, or I'd say the scientific explanation for that, is because we all share humanity. And so we share that same background into evolution. We share those same moral sentiments.
Okay. I'll go ahead. Hayden, do you have another question?
Yeah. And I really these are questions just to help me understand kind of where you're coming from and help our viewers who may be less familiar with your worldview, kind of just help them, make sense. Sure. How would you explain a society that does not value the 10 Commandments? Because surely there has been some. So how does that work? If we receive our morality more or less from our genes, has there ever been a society? I guess I'm not studied enough to really make a call on that, who has not aligned with the rest of the world, and how do you deal with that idea, or with that reality, I should say?
Yeah, I don't know specifically of a society that didn't have the same moral sentiments. It seems like they're pretty shared, but like we could say Buddhism or something, right? Okay. Buddhism doesn't have a 10 Commandments of the same type, right? That we find in Christianity. Instead, primarily, the main tenet, I guess, of Buddhism is to avoid dissatisfaction or to avoid suffering, right? That's the whole point of the Buddhist endeavor, is they recognize that to live is to suffer or to be dissatisfied. And then through meditation and these various practices, you can discover ways to feel more satisfied in life. And it also has whole moral principles, but they're not coming from a Christian tradition. It's coming from a different tradition. But in the end, you end up with moral principles that don't look that different from those you see in the Christian world, right? You still end up with kindness. You still end up with compassion. you still end up with laws that reflect human sentiments. And so that's my case, is that it's not unique to any one group or one religion, but it's shared across humanity. Is that making sense, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. I do have some more questions, but I'm sure we'll get into it as we continue.
Well, let's start to delve into some of the questions here. I was going to start with a question that I have. So, so I want to start from this perspective and just see what you think, and then I'll kind of ask my question. So I actually agree that moral language, the language of morality, the good and the bad, the should and the shouldn't, always is describing, in a moral sense, whenever you're talking about morality, is an action's relation to suffering, right? I just can't think of anyone calling something good that just causes suffering without any good attached to that, right? It's just, right. That's what the bad is. The bad is to suffer, right? Now, here's where I have a little bit of a question, though, because morality as I view it, and I want to see what you think of this. I'm actually going to pull up a slide here for us to take a look at. And it's this notion that morality equals value. So we could say it's something's relationship to suffering, the good and the bad part of it, right? But plus obligation. And the reason I want to bring in this idea of obligation is because I think it's important to understand that when people are talking about morality, they're not just saying what is good and bad in their opinion, right? When I'm talking about morality, I'm saying you should do this. You have an obligation to behave in a particular way. I'm not merely stating that, because otherwise it'd just be my preference. Like, yeah, I think Captain Crunch is good. Maybe you don't. Maybe you think that it's bad. But those are just value judgments. It's very different when I say, no, like Captain Crunch is good and you should therefore eat it, right? We have to, like, morality tends to deal with what we should and should not do, not simply what we value and don't value, right? Now, I just want to stop there. And is that a fair way of, is obligation an essential ingredient in this equation?
I'm going to, for the purpose of discussion, I'll say yes. That I'll agree with you that if I follow what you're saying, I'll pick up what you're putting down here. Is that, yeah, I'd say that morality is about how should we interact with each other within the context in order to maximize our well-being, right? We talked, and I know you've talked about Sam Harris and the moral landscape. He talks a lot about well-being. Sam Harris The Moral Landscape is really just a restatement of John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism, right? It's just the same thing. Most happiness for the most amount of people, and we try and evaluate things. What Sam is saying in The Moral Landscapes, he believes that science can come in and help inform this, this debate or this discussion, rather than saying it's purely something that religion can do. That's kind of his approach. Yeah, and I tend to agree with him.
Frankly, yeah. I think I'm a big fan of Sam Harris's work. Now this is where I get into, there's an area when we get into the notion of obligation, I tend to wonder, where is the basis for that? Because it's one thing to say that human flourishing is, great, but what if I don't care about the general human flourishing? What if I care about just the human flourishing of my tribe and my genes in a competitive world? Like, why is there any obligation to go beyond the well-being of those that I care about and that affect me? Because ultimately, if someone's well-being in no way affects mine, why should I sacrifice it? Like for instance, like, maybe I could do something today that would affect some alien on some planet a bajillion miles away for the better in a bajillion years from now. Why am I under an obligation to take that action? Right? So I guess this is where I really have a problem, where my challenge is with Sam, and I'm curious to hear what you have to say, is we all talk about human flourishing or he uses the word well-being, which I actually think is a better term. We always talk about human well-being in sort of the ether. My question is when the rubber hits the road, the well-being that I care about is my own. And the reason I care about the well-being of my children and those around me is because it affects my own well-being. So where does this notion come from that I have some sort of an obligation to humanity as a general thing rather than just to my gene pool and the people that I care about?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question. You're hitting on a lot of moral philosophy, right? Once you step away from the religious philosophy, which to me seems to be mostly about you follow these principles and rules that have been passed to you by revelation, you get over into the non-religious world of philosophy, and you do run into exactly the question you're pointing about. Well, why would I care about anybody else? Why isn't it just a war of all against all? You know, like the Hobbesian Leviathan idea that we need a government to try and impose upon us, otherwise we can't handle it ourselves, right? Why be good? Why be moral? That's the question you're asking, right?
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, even to define morality, if morality is defined as some, as I look at it, as the relationship of an action to suffering, well, I care about my suffering and the suffering of those that I care about more than anyone else. And in fact, from a purely genetic standpoint, let's just take the hard example here. Adolf Hitler's idea was we need to genetically breed up the stock, filter out the weak, and basically create it's the supremacist mindset. It's my genes, my tribe, my pool, everyone else can go to hell, and burn them all down. And I worry that the social Darwinism is a very easy step to take unless you have an answer to the question for why following because you're saying we got these sentiments from evolution. Well, evolution doesn't tell me to love all of humanity. It tells me to spread my genes. It also tells me that I'm in a competition for survival in a world of limited resources. So I'm just going to put that out there and say, like, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question to ask. And for a long time, historically, and I think you guys will agree with this, that it was a lot of wars and people fighting over this historically, right? It's not really until the Enlightenment, which I think did come out of Christianity, that you start to focus on the individual and the rights of the individual. The divine individual comes out of Christianity, right? And then gets picked up by the Enlightenment to say, well, governments, rather than existing by divine right, that God put governments into place in order to enforce morality, in order to do this, well, maybe governments exist for the rights of the people, for human, and in order to maximize their flourishing. This is, the John Locke philosophy and what we then see in the United States of America approach. And it is kind of new, right? That's why it makes it cool and exciting. It's the Enlightenment. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I say we've made progress in our moral arc, right? That at one time it was very tribal and just localized to the people who you lived with. And then we got bigger and we got into cities and states. And when we did that, we had to take those moral sentiments and objectify them into a rule of law, right? So you see like the Code of Hammurabi, 1,000 years before the Mosaic Law, where they're talking about this on their code, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not murder. And this is before there's anything Abrahamic, right? And then we just keep growing these out. And now we're at a level where we're talking about a species level thing. And so
I guess I'm just wondering, like, why would the morality of a tribal society who wants to take over and dominate, why is their morality, like, by what standard are you judging that morality to be more like not like, if you're gonna have progress, there has to be some way that we're measuring that progress, and you're using the rubric of general human flourishing as that standard. But that standard in my mind seems to be kind of arbitrary, because the way I see it is you're choosing the flourishing of the entire whole with the arbitrary boundary of human beings instead of including animals and everything else in it, because we make animals suffer all the time for our well-being. And so
we'd want to include those too, because they're conscious, right?
Okay,
to a certain level, right? Yeah, but yeah,
fair enough. And maybe that's another discussion or another point to go into. But I guess what I'm saying is another group prefers their tribe and not universal humanity. Why is one of those answers right and one of those wrong? Or is it just arbitrary that you chose to go with the whole of humanity and they chose to go with the group, and neither side has the quote unquote right answer? Like, how do you adjudicate that issue?
Yeah, and that's where I think we can relate to the Sam Harris stuff, or the utilitarian approach, which is we look for the most good for the most people, right? You start approaching it from a standpoint of.
But isn't that just an arbitrary presupposition?
Well, it's arbitrary if you look at it from the standpoint of the entire universe or whatever, right? But if you look at it from the species of us living together on this planet, and we all have to get along, it starts to make rational sense.
But do we all have to get along? I mean, what if enslaving, 5% of the population increases the well-being of 95%?
Right. So you're, if that were a case, then you might have something. But so far we haven't been able to find a situation, right? I think throughout history where you can throw away your moral sentiments about a certain group of people or whatever, and still improve the well-being of the people who are the enslavers, right? We could go kind of deep down the hole, I guess, but my sense is that your moral sentiments, your notion of who you are as a good person, will get drug under when you start to realize the inhumanity that you're exposing on other humans. I mean, in the Book of Mormon, right? You've got the story of, what is it, that the Lamanites who are about to be all attacked, and they fall to their knees and they just get slaughtered. But in the process, right, it converts more people, right, than are killed. So I'm saying those moral sentiments.
To steelman that, I think I see what you're saying. I just want to make sure I understand it. So the idea is you're saying that there's something within human beings themselves that won't allow them to do things, like it will cause them suffering to enslave other people or to do terrible things to other people because they have moral sentiments. And so it's sort of like these moral sentiments won't let you get away with harming the 5% for your benefit, because at the end of the day, it will torment you.
Yeah, essentially, I'm taking the Sam Harris moral landscape idea, and I'm saying, well, there may be a peak over there, a local peak of white supremacists have developed some sort of society that they feel is pretty good, but it will be inferior to a society that has adopted universal human rights, where they'll have a higher peak with more well-being and better goodness and more trade, and that cooperation will actually prove to be a competitive advantage over a society that adopts moral values that are not appealing to other tribes or other groups. In other words, I'm saying cooperation is a competitive advantage. So that if you've got a tribe or an organization that people want to join, like the United States of America, because of its principles, right? Everybody comes flowing in. Well, that they flow towards that moral principle because it's better for them, right? Because they recognize they can have greater well-being in this society.
So essentially what you're saying is that on a species level, or even the individual, I guess the individual will never, they can't get away with harming other people. Essentially, if they go and do harm to other people and take advantage of other people, it will be to their detriment in the long run as a society, right?
In general, I think that would be the case. There may be exceptions. You have psychopaths, but most people have a conscience, right? We're built in, we're born with conscience, right? And so I think that if you go against your conscience, you will find yourself very unhappy at some point. And that would be one of the primary arguments. But it's also just built in, right? Because it's one of those things where we'll, like, if we try and rationalize every little thing in how we feel about stuff, we probably can't do it, right? We're getting into the is-ought. But we can definitely get together as a society and agree upon some principles that we all say this will be best for all of us who are engaged with it.
So, and this is where I maybe struggle with that idea a little bit, is that my understanding is that, especially in studying human history, is that human beings have generally followed sort of the dog-eat-dog model. And that makes perfect sense evolutionarily speaking. Okay. We are not programmed to support general humanity. We are programmed to propagate our own genes. And especially within a competitive environment, our genetics are at odds with our competitors, right? And so, as I see it, rather than an evolutionary change, what has happened is a cultural change. The reason that you and I don't behave like Romans did isn't because of evolution. It's because of ideas that
Right, and I
propagate.
agree with that completely. Yeah, I'm not denying that at all. Right.
And so what I'm saying is maybe what you are calling moral sentiments and your conscience granted to you by evolution. I would say my conscience is probably most influenced by the culture and the socialization that I went through in a Western Christian Latter-day Saint household. And not only that goes for my entire culture that I'm ensconced in. And so the values that I actually hold and the moral sentiments that I feel have far less to do with sort of the dog eat dog Darwinism that is in my genes, but rather to what I was taught in my home. And my thing is this: I actually think that I have to struggle mightily against the natural sentiments of my nature in order to not descend into what nature wants me to be. And so in my mind, I look at this and I guess I just have I see, when I see evolution at play, I see nature at play, and I see the Hobbesian nightmare. I see power. I see preference, because believe me, everyone's real moral until they're starving. And then you'll kill your neighbor to make sure your babies survive. You know what I'm saying? And so in my mind, I guess where I struggle is that I don't see nature as this great conveyor of the moral law to us. I see the moral law as the creation of something within, or I wouldn't say the creation, I would say the discovery. We may disagree there, but that is something that exists within our culture, within our rationality, and that we can actually reason that some things create higher levels of flourishing, and that those things go contrary to our natural instincts. And so I guess I just have a hard time feeling that I have any obligation to follow my natural instincts. Yet I feel like, and maybe I'm wrong, I feel like that's what you're saying is the origin of our obligations is the natural order.
Yeah, I'm saying those sentiments, compassion, empathy, sense of fairness, sense of justice, a lot of these things that we root our moral sentiments in are shared universally throughout all of humanity, right? Those sorts of things.
But do they? I mean, maybe we look around today after the world's been so heavily Christianized and we can see those values. But go back to the Roman times. Their notion of fairness, the Aztecs, their notion of rights and all these things, those weren't universal in the human condition. They were literally granted by the Enlightenment and Christianity.
Yeah, and I'm agreeing with that too, that we've seen this moral progress, but the sentiments are there, right? Our desires to be good to one another, to help one another, started from those tribal basic sentiments. And then as civilization has come, and you're exactly right, as our culture has developed, we've expanded the tribal limits. We started with maybe 150 people in our tribe, and then as the tribes got bigger, well, we didn't have the moral sentiments that we had weren't sufficient to deal with a larger community, right? Like you're saying, you're exactly right. I only care about my own people, but I want to live in a larger society because that's a competitive advantage. There's more people to trade with. There's more people to protect me because we all agree with things. And so we come up with a rule of law. We say, well, the same things that I would do to protect my children or protect my family, we're going to make those laws for everybody who's in our society. And that becomes kind of the objective part. And then we can compare different societies based on their different rule of law to say, well, this society is higher on the moral landscape and the people there have more well-being than this society over here. Like say the Taliban has, one thing and the Christians in America have something else. We can compare the well-being of these different societies that have built from their moral sentiments. some sort of political structure, some sort of, moral framework that they're operating in, and say they're both based on the same sort of desire to see human flourishing, but one of them's doing a lot better than the other. Why is that? Right? One of them's doing better. And then you can compare and contrast those different systems and try and arrive at something that gets us forward. And that's why I think the moral arc is getting better. That's why I think we see, in our modern society, we really are concerned about people all over the planet in a way that we weren't 200 years ago. Certainly not 400 or 1,000 years ago or in Roman times. Exactly. I totally agree. If we went back far enough, people would be living in just bands and tribes, right? And they're at constant war. But in our modern society, we have kind of universalized. It's become the universal human rights. People recognize that in order for people to flourish, we have to start focusing on the individual and say everybody should have these sort of protections under the law.
So just to clarify, would you say you agree or disagree with what Jacob said about this idea that every individual has rights and that we should, and kind of what you're saying, would you say that that goes along with the evolutionary, nature's call to us, or is it contrary to nature's call? Would you?
I would say that the introduction of natural rights, which comes out of the Enlightenment, I'd say that's. I don't know if it's in line. I got to be careful of doing some sort of naturalistic fallacy here and saying, that's what I think it is. But I don't. I guess it's easier to just put it this way: that I see morality as a human endeavor, right? It's just us. There's nobody out there who's trying to tell us what to do. This is how I view it, right? As a non-believer. So we've got to try and figure it out for ourselves. And the best way to do that is to try and maximize the opportunities for well-being, maximize the opportunities for people to be as happy as possible within their society.
So how do you deal with individuals who lie, cheat, and steal for their own benefit?
Lock them up. That's why we have laws.
Okay, but basically everyone, right? I'm assuming you've lied, cheated, and stole, right? Just like the rest of us, and maybe less so as we get older and more mature, but I'm trying to step out of my Christian LDS worldview, because we would say that the natural man is an enemy to God, right? In that we are these spiritual beings having a physical experience, trying to learn to control that natural urge to sin, is what we would call it. But what we would say sin is to make others suffer, or to make us suffer by making others suffer. Does that make sense? So how do we deal with, and I'm trying to step into your worldview, do you see people as generally good, or do you see them as generally looking out for themselves?
I see them as generally mixed, but I think mostly good. I think most people strive to try and be good to the people that are around them. I think that's built into our instincts in the same way that you might see it in other animals, right? That most people have this natural inclination. You see it in children, right? You see it in very young kids, until they're taught to hate, until they're taught to reject people. That the natural inclination is to be friendly with the people with whom you interact. At least that's what I believe that the data shows, right? That when they do studies on children, the people they're very trusting, right? They're very much like everybody's a good person until they learn differently. Is my understanding, and so that's what I'd say is people are naturally inclined towards being kind of good citizens within their tribe or within their organization. They have guilt and shame that helps to reify that.
And I realize you're not a biologist. I'm assuming you're right.
No, a video game guy. Yeah, I made video games.
and I respect that. I'm curious to know if you have a take on where selfish inclinations come from, right? Is it just from society? And if so, where did it come from before society existed as we know it today? Like if children were always good, which we'd say they are, right? But where was the first, or why did the first individual start to go off that path? Obviously, we don't know who that first individual was. Does that make sense? Like, where's the origin of selfishness then?
I think selfishness is built into us too, right? That we started out just like any animals or anything, that we're mostly concerned with ourselves and our own propagation, right? And our own survival. So I'm not saying that it's all one thing or the other thing. I'm saying it's complex shades of gray, right? But I'm trying to make the point that you can have compassion, empathy, justice, fairness, all these sorts of things in a universe that doesn't rely upon God to give them to you. That's my contention. I'm not saying you guys are necessarily wrong for believing in God. I'm saying here's a different way to approach the subject that I think is rooted in science, that I think is rooted in history, and is rooted in biology.
So an interesting take here from a Latter-day Saint perspective. What's funny is that my understanding of this is not totally, it actually isn't that far different from yours. Okay.
Yeah.
I agree. And what's funny is that I think LDS theology has a really interesting and unique take on morality that brings it much closer to what we're talking about here than do other Christian religions, which have sort of divine command theory, which says that morality is determined by what God dictates. Okay. And we actually don't believe that. We believe that God is even accountable to what we call the eternal law, or kind of what you might say even are the inherent conditions of reality, right? Because if morality is describing suffering and well-being, right? And there are laws, let's say, in the universe, you might say that they're purely naturalistic laws. And we may even say that to some extent too, because we are not dualists. But you might say that we believe that morality ultimately is not determined by the will of God, but is determined by the nature of reality. And you would say probably the same thing.
Yeah. I would say
reality
essentially
itself
the same thing.
Is what determines it, because it's describing the nature of suffering and well-being. Okay. Now, here's where I think we might diverge and where our opinions are different, is that when we talk about this suffering and well-being, again, in the ether, in the general, in the abstract, it fails to account for the challenge of the fact that being is experienced individually. Okay. And the greatest good, you could say, for society might be the well-being, most good for the most people, right? You might say something like that. But that may not be the most good for me. For instance, if I go and, or let's say somebody decides that they can cheat on their wife, and she's not going to be the wiser. Let's say that's just like essentially guaranteed. And therefore your well-being is going to increase. The person you're cheating on, they enjoy themselves, and your wife's none the wiser. And therefore, on that moral calculus, where we're measuring it all by well-being, you've gotten away with it. And therefore, everyone in that equation has a higher level of well-being in that equation. You also could deal, and that's maybe even a little more mundane one. If I know I only have X amount of years left to even exist at all, in other words, my being itself only has 5 years left, well, what if I spend it doing things that are just awful for the world, but boy, oh boy, they're great for me? You know what I mean? Like, the problem is if well-being is the measure of all morality, my well-being is the measure of all morality for me. And so the degree to which I would view an action as good and something that I should do would rationally, in my mind, only depend on me, because I don't experience the well-being of other people. And now everyone needs to be very careful what I'm saying here. So it's like, pause. I'm not saying that my helping another person doesn't make me feel better. But remember, it's me who's feeling better because I did this good thing. And if an action in no way causes me well-being, or only causes me to suffer more, like, why would I ever sacrifice for the greater good of the group. That's an irrational thing. You could say, well, you have moral sentiments that are, want to see your genes propagate or whatever. So what? Like, I care a lot more about me enjoying my life than I do about my genes, maybe someone distantly related to me, maybe having a better experience and having an extra child or something. It just doesn't seem to, like, I don't see how that, like I said, on the level of the collective, it seems to make sense. But the problem is this: you don't exist as a collective. You exist as an individual.
Right. And I think you're making some very good points there, right? If I'm following you correctly, that you're saying, why would I ever care about anybody else? Why isn't it just about me, right? And my own satisfactions. Is that right?
Yeah, but I would say it this way. The well-being of the group, only rationally speaking, because then I'm trying to get into this atheist mindset, the well-being of the group only matters to me to the degree that it affects me. Like for instance, let's say that there were people on some planet 80 bajillion light years from here, and me doing something now might benefit them, even though it sucks for me. It might benefit them 100 million years from now. Now, in the moral calculus, that would say, yeah, you're supposed to do that. But I'd be like, what? That makes no sense. Because if it doesn't affect me, if my being itself comes to an end in however many years, I need to milk every bit of well-being and get rid of every bit of suffering out of it that I can in these 80 years. The group only is relevant to me to the degree that it affects me. Because otherwise, if it doesn't affect me, then why would I care? It's like caring about the suffering of ants. Like, I don't really care if ants suffer, right? It doesn't affect me. So that's why I torch them with a torch if they're biting my horse's legs. You know what I mean? And I don't feel bad for it.
Right.
And so the thing is I just have this trouble drawing this distinction. Again, it comes down, it seems arbitrary to me that we say, well, the most good for the most people without any reference to you. And this is a very pressing question on the nature of rights. See, the Enlightenment said this. It also said that you as the individual have rights, and that the group can't harm you for their well-being for more people. Right? And
yes.
And so here's the thing. This is the other thing. I get really scared because if you're going to say that the most good for the most people is the ultimate measure of if something is moral, well, then if that person's existence or that person's whatever it is causing a problem for the collective, well, then they don't have any rights.
Yeah, and I can see where you're going with this. At least where I think you're going with this. What I think you're getting at is that people will sacrifice themselves for ideas or ideologies that are not in their own best interest, right? They'll go to war, they'll die for a cause, they'll martyr themselves, right? Because they believe in something. It doesn't necessarily have to be religious, but a lot of times it is, right? And to that, that is a case of where culture has shaped somebody's morality into a position where they now see that that's right. So I'm not saying that culture doesn't play a role. I'm saying culture is very important in defining what those notions of morality are, even though they're built on these same basic moral sentiments. So we can evaluate different cultures based on how well they
but again,
help us.
And I want to make sure you got this, because I'm not just saying that there might be people who do things that harm themselves. I'm saying, why would I care about the well-being of the entire group if over my own? You know what I'm saying?
Right.
It's like, if the group can be better off by me suffering immensely, right? Why would I say, okay, I'm going to go suffer immensely. I'm not getting anything out of this. It's just suffering. Then I die. And I see this.
Then you're Jesus, right?
Exactly. And that's the thing. If Jesus had not rose from the dead, that's exactly what that story would be. It would say you go and experience the ultimate suffering and for nothing, and everyone else goes to hell anyway. And it's like, well, that didn't. The whole way we measure the morality of Jesus is based on this idea of that there is something that is gained out of it, that suffering can end because of his suffering, right? It was a true sacrifice. But this is what I'm getting at. The problem I have with this moral system that Sam describes and a lot of people describe based on the well-being of the collective.
Now be careful, because Sam doesn't do that, right? And I'm not doing that either. We're saying that you have to do both. Individual and collective are both considerations.
Well, and
individual is probably the primary.
But why? Yeah. Why would the group factor into my equation at all? Only to the degree that it affects me. To me, in my mind, this is just the way that I do it. If I were in your shoes and I held these presuppositions, I would reject the well-being of the group. The group is a means to my ends.
Now, you know what? That's very common. I've noticed for religious people to say that, like, if I were removed from my moral framework, and I'm putting words into your mouth, but if I was removed from my moral framework, I would immediately try and get away with all I could, right? I could murder or cheat or whatever.
I'm going to be more careful about that, because this is what I'm saying. I'm not saying that I would go out and do those things. Okay. I'm saying that I would do the things that I could get away with, and it would be rational to do so. I'm not saying it on some sort of a twisted, like, oh, I want to go do bad stuff. I'm saying if I were being rationally consistent, if I could increase my well-being by cheating on my wife, what is the rational reason not to do it? If I now people would say, well, what if you get caught? I'm saying let's just play with the guarantee that I'm not going to be caught. The moral calculus tells me this is the moral action. And that goes to the group as well. If I could enslave someone and increase my well-being, I don't care about the group. I don't care about the future state of all this and the stability of society long-term. Like, who cares? Its well-being is experienced by me. And so I have a very, I want to approach this from the perspective of I'm putting on my atheist hat and I'm trying to figure out where would I go if I did that. And what's really scary to me is that I would gravitate towards radical individualism and supremacy. Basically, whatever is good for me, everyone becomes a means to my ends. They are not ends in themselves. And that's scary to me. And so talk me out of it. Why is the collective important, even if it doesn't benefit me?
Yeah. So I'm hearing, and I've heard this argument a lot, right? That in fact, Ayn Rand kind of goes down this path. Says the man's moral purpose is the pursuit of his own happiness, right? Mm-hmm. That's her whole, and she's an atheistic philosopher, right? So there are schools of thought that go down that path. And so I guess it's worth pointing out that there are a lot of different ways you could go with this. Moral philosophy is not just boils down to one or two little things, right? So there is that direction that you could go. As far as the question of why don't I do these things? Why don't I try and get away with all I can? Well,
I would say, why shouldn't I do them?
Why shouldn't I? Okay.
Why don't I do them is different. I'm asking, why do I have a moral obligation to the group and to humanity generally instead of just to myself? Even if it doesn't benefit me.
Yes, your actions will still have consequences, right? Whether or not you believe in morality or not, whatever you do is going to potentially impact you in some way. So I'm going to agree with you that there's probably not clear rational reasons for why you would or would not pursue your own ends, but there are very likely sentimental or emotional reasons why you wouldn't do that. Use the example of cheating, right? Cheating on your wife or something. You might say, well, I could get away with that and I'll improve my own well-being. But then the question is, but would you really? Or would you?
But so to that, I would think that
through, right?
I would go back to Nietzsche. And I would read Nietzsche, and I would say,
great, right?
say, that's my slave morality speaking. That's my Christianity that turned me into this groveling little coward who won't go and sleep with all the women the way the Romans used to do, and be the champion with the master morality that I should have. And I have a very hard time walking away from that argument, because it seems to me that the sentiments that I have, the consequences that I'm feeling, are because of my socialization. And so I need to use reason to reject these irrational sentiments and embrace what is rational.
Right. So that's, you're following Nietzsche's will to power sort of approach, right?
Yes.
That we're saying, well, if we could just do away with this Christian slave morality, then everybody could go back to some sort of Roman notion of we fight it out and you resolve disputes through duels, right? That sort of thing. Whoever's the strongest wins, right? Will to power. That's
and that I mean, that seems to me to be the natural way.
And it has been for much of human history, right? I'm not denying that. But what I am suggesting to you is that there's been a moral progress over time as we've built our society and civilization up to where we no longer think in those terms because it's not best for us generally.
But
right?
then I would say
that the individuals might defect, though. Yeah.
Then there becomes a conflict. There becomes a conflict between your vision of social betterment versus my vision of I want to be a Roman and be who I want to be. And I think this is where I think we're actually arriving at where I think we could both agree that if there is this struggle between the group, their preferences, and my preferences as an individual, this is where I get with sort of atheistic morality. It does boil down to arbitrary wills to power. The will to power of the group to preserve the order that they want as the group, and the will to power of individuals and or subgroups who want to organize society according to their values and their preferences. And so in my mind, I think Nietzsche had it right. It's who's going to win the power struggle. Christianity has become dominant in the world, but is that because they have a better system per se, or is it because they've been more ruthless in their power in basically convincing people to adopt slave morality? But that we could rise up and reject that slave morality and embrace the hero morality and the Ubermensch sort of idea, like he had said. I mean, I guess I just look at that and I go, it all seems to come down to arbitrary wills to power, battling it out in a world of limited resources.
And I think if you're going from Nietzsche and that perspective, I think you're very much on the right track. But within a non-religious framework, there is no scripture, right? There is no dogma. Just because Nietzsche said it doesn't mean it's law, right? So there are a lot of existential philosophers who disagree with some of Nietzsche's stuff. Like I kind of follow Albert Camus, and I think that direction actually takes you in a position that gets you back towards being more moral in sense. And also, but I guess what I'm saying is Nietzsche isn't the end all of atheism, right? Worthwhile to read, worthwhile to understand. He raises some good points, but then many other philosophers have taken those points.
I'm curious, how would you reconcile this? I tend to find two atheists that I have a lot of respect for, and you can correct where you think these guys are wrong, are both Nietzsche and Foucault. I actually think Foucault is actually brilliant, despite having huge issues with him, obviously, for a variety of different reasons. But I think he diagnoses the nature of power dynamics within a society at the level of sort of cultural warfare within the linguistics that we use and the way that our socialization is ultimately about certain preferences that people have collectively as groups, and them trying to push those preferences onto other people to join their tribe, essentially, to battle for a worldview that they have of the way they think things ought to be, right? There are these moral sort of currents in society of the way things, but in my mind, the moral system of the Aztecs, the moral system of whoever. These are just different individuals conglomerating with other individuals to satisfy what they think will bring themselves individually the greatest good. It's kind of like an alliance of individuals to say this sort of life will bring us to ourselves the highest level of well-being. Human beings are inherently selfish in that sense that they, and I don't want to, maybe selfish is a bad word, but self-interested first, right? And so in my mind, the way to frame the human experience has been, like Foucault says, it's a power network of people competing with one another for dominance of their particular what they think will bring them the greatest well-being. And I don't see a way, and this is where I maybe want to invite you. How does people like Camus and others, how would they address that to make it not just about arbitrary power battles within social groups?
Yeah, I think we're kind of starting to circle a little bit, because I think from my reading of philosophers that once you eliminate God from the equation, right, once you're trying to look at it, they do go back, most of them, to human flourishing and evaluating things on how many people within a given society feel like they're achieving their ends, or they're feeling like they're the happiest. In the United States of America, we've got the Declaration of Independence, which basically lays out, this is why we're setting up this government. It's to preserve the rights of the people so that they can figure out life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness on their own.
Even the Declaration of Independence is about the individual having rights.
Yes, it is.
Which again it seems to fly in the face of the idea of the most good for the most people, because it says in the Declaration, the basic idea is you have rights. Even if it's does more good for more people, they can't take away it from you, because you as the individual have rights, which are inherent in you, given to you by your creator. But we won't need to go into that. But my thing is on what basis does the collective say that the individual's well-being takes priority over the well-being of the group? I thought this was about the most good for the most people.
Well, by focusing on the individual, this is the Enlightenment theory, it provides the opportunities for most people to discover for themselves what is right within that society. That's the whole idea of kind of libertarian approach to politics, is that you have just minimal rules, right, and allow people to explore freedom of religion. In this country, you're going to be able to find the religion that fits you the best. But as a government, we're just going to focus on these basic rights, right? We're going to make sure these are what we're protecting, and we'll have laws and courts. But as far as finding your purpose and finding your culture and your moral center, the government is going to be agnostic about that, right? Separation of church and state. That's how I see that, is that by focusing on the individual, giving the individual the right to pursue their happiness, their life and liberty, it maximizes for that society opportunities for flourishing. So that's why I'm saying the focus on the individual is the right way to go.
And I can see, so basically, let me see if what you're saying is, if I understand it, is that the best way to maximize your own individual well-being is to grant other people their own individual autonomy, and to not rob them of their
essentially right. Yes. Yeah. The universal human rights helps everybody. Right. And so it's kind of like a social contract. We'll get together and say, hey, in this country, we're going to support universal rights. We'll have a Bill of Rights, First Amendment, Second Amendment, Third Amendment. We're going to lay these things out to help maximize within our society what we believe will result in human flourishing. And it seems to have worked pretty well as long as it's in place.
And I agree. There's a level of human cooperation that is needed, let's say, for and I want to grant this point. There's a level of individual cooperation that's needed for you as an individual to flourish. There just is. But this is where I think where the calculations tend to fall apart, is that the morality that I look at, the group still, to me as the individual, is a means to my end. The only reason I value the group is to the degree that the group benefits me. The group has no inherent value in the sense of I need to sacrifice myself and my well-being for the good of the group as a whole. That's where some of this stuff rationally, again, there are limits to it as I see it. It just,
You're starting to sound like Ayn Rand.
I think Ayn Rand had something to say.
Yeah,
and I think
Ayn Rand talks about, the individual is the key and rational self-interest.
Well, the thing is, I don't like, again, I don't believe it. The problem is we create the collective as if it were a thing. The collective is just a group of it's a bunch of individuals who have like gotten together with a similar objective in mind. And I agree that can produce great flourishing. But I don't think human beings held slaves throughout literally all of human history because it was so bad for them. I think they did it because it increased their well-being in a world of limited resources. And I think the reason that we don't have slaves today, a lot of it has to do, I think it has to do primarily with Christianity. And then number two, I would say it also has to do with technology. The fact that we can produce such abundance. I think technology has changed what you might call the moral landscape in huge degrees, because I'll tell you what, when scarcity happens, everyone's like universal, like be good to everyone goes away real fast when your babies are hungry. Okay.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Yeah. And so my thing is, while I agree that the well-being of the collective is what we're describing with moral language, it doesn't seem to translate to the level of the individual, because the individual doesn't give a crap ultimately about the good of the group, except for in relation to how that group benefits them. Does that make sense? I mean, is that a fair way of framing it? Because unless I find a reason that the group matters, like my own well-being matters because it matters. I mean, that's the definition of what matters is my own well-being. If it, I guess I just don't understand why the group would matter to the individual in any way other than to their own selfish ends. And the thing is that a group is unsustainable if it's not, like, people don't go and die in a war for the group. It's like, that makes no sense at all. Right.
Right. But people do. They go and die all the time in wars. Right. And why are they doing that?
But that's because they believe in something bigger than just themselves. In other words, we would say that they're acting irrationally. They're having delusions, but yet all of us have this great respect for people who go and sacrifice themselves for the good of the group.
Right.
But in all reality, we should look at those people as absolute idiots.
Well, yeah, but not necessarily, right? Because sometimes there are cases where we heroize, right? We lionize people who sacrifice themselves for the betterment of our tribe or whatever. That's been going on. And so I think that's also why people will have an impulse to sometimes want to sacrifice themselves for their group, because then they become lionized, even though they're dead, right? But they recognize, like,
Yeah, but martyrs. that doesn't increase your well-being if you're dead. You're
no,
gone.
It doesn't.
You don't exist.
Right. It's not a rational thing to do. It's done based on ideology and your emotion in that case.
I thought atheists are the ones to say, look, we need to act on reason and not just these emotions that we have.
Yeah, and that's a common misconception, I'm afraid, is that atheists have abandoned emotion altogether, and I don't think that's the case at all. I think most of your atheist thinkers will say, no, human emotion is very important in this discussion. Hume, a very notable atheist, right, kind of kicked all this off. That's where moral sentiments came from, trying to deal with the is-ought problem and saying, we can't reason this out. but we still have these sentiments. We still have these feelings. Maybe we can build from those feelings something that maximizes the good, within our society. So really, it is a recognition of reason doesn't solve this problem, but our emotions may give us a lamppost in the right direction. From there, we do have to evaluate things and say, well, different societies work better than different other societies for the well-being. Different people want to live in different groups and organizations. So we run all these experiments as a species, and hopefully over time, and I think it is the case, we've gotten better at it, and that our society today looks a lot better than it did 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, or 10,000 years ago, in terms of longevity and livelihood and all the things we care about for our well-being, because of this great experiment and our learning about what makes civilization tick.
Troy, and kind of just to bring us back to kind of the main topic, is there anything that we've said that would make you think that we're misunderstanding where you're coming from? Or do you feel like you've been steel-manned, or do you feel like we're still missing it?
I think through this discussion, I think you guys maybe have a little better understanding of where I was coming from, which is all I was trying to do. I'm not trying to necessarily convince you that I'm right. I'm more interested in discovering what's right than in being right, if that makes sense. I want to know what the truth is out there. That's kind of what led me out of the church in the first place, right? Trying to discover what I thought the truth was. So I don't feel like I'm defending anything. I'm just trying to.
But do you feel understood, though? Will you walk away from this saying, like, I feel like I was heard and understood? Because the worst thing that could happen is us walk away and say, okay, we understand totally where he's coming from, and not. Does that make sense? Is there anything else you can tell us, or is there any questions you have for us?
Well, one of the questions, because we've talked a lot, the alternate view is kind of this presuppositionalist, you need God as a moral standard, right? That God provides you with a moral standard. But, one of my criticisms is like, okay, suppose I just accept that. Okay, we need God as a moral standard. You immediately run into the next problem. Which God? And how do you interpret it? And there's so many gods throughout history, so many different stories of what has happened. And it's not just Christian, right? You've got to deal with our Hindu past or Buddhist past. We've got all this stuff out there. So you can't even evaluate religion without making an appeal to moral sentiments anyway. You start looking at it and saying, this religion's better than that one because they provide more well-being.
And Troy, I actually think you make a great point there, actually. And I actually think that's one of the strengths of LDS thought, is that we don't root morality in the nature and nature of God himself. My understanding of the way that a Latter-day Saint would root morality is that God is still necessary simply because of cosmic justice. So let me lay this out this way. We talked about sort of this idea of, can you get away with stuff, right? So like, can you actually harm someone else? Can you increase your well-being by harming the well-being of another person? My argument is that is possible in the world. It is possible to harm someone else and to increase your well-being. And if my well-being is the ultimate standard of what is good, if well-being, which translates into my well-being, ultimately, then what is moral for me is to do what increases my well-being, right? That's the way I would view it. Now, where does God come into this? You don't get away with anything. In other words, if I harm someone else, it will long-term affect my well-being for the negative. We're all interconnected because of God, right? And so in my mind, that's the way that why God is a necessary component to that particular moral system. Whereas I look at, if there was no God, you could get away with stuff. And I just think that you can't.
Right. And I understand that argument. Here's the issue that I have primarily with it, is that you can get away with it, whether you're, if you're, let's see, what's the best way to put this? I think whether you believe in God or not, You may still get away with stuff, but in the religious viewpoint, you want a God there to make sure that doesn't happen, right? To me, it's special pleading. It's saying, we want to live in a world where nobody can get away with doing bad things. Therefore, we're going to invent this idea of a super being who watches and tracks every sparrow, make sure that everything that happens is tracked and accounted for and made right in the end. Mm-hmm. But to me, that feels like humans trying to come up with, man, this moral problem is really, really hard. So let's just say that there's a super God that
the
we
idea
can appeal
here
to.
is that the world is not fair, and so you
Right.
want to have someone who ultimately balances all the accounts and creates ultimate justice.
And it also scares all the people who are trying to defect into not defecting, right? It scares all the people who are trying to get away with something not to do.
And fair enough. I mean, that comes down ultimately to, is there actually, a God and a lot of that. I mean, some of this stuff is sort of, it can feel that way, and I totally get that. But if there was, if a person believes in ultimate justice, right?
If they believe in ultimate justice, like cosmic justice, like you just said.
In
See,
some
I
sort
don't
of a
do that.
cosmic
I don't
justice,
believe in that.
and that's the thing. If people don't believe in cosmic justice, I think this goes back to what we were talking about. If you don't believe in cosmic justice, then it means you can get away with stuff. And what I'm saying is,
there can be bad people in the world. Yes.
But my thing is, it isn't just that you're bad people. I wouldn't even necessarily call them bad people. I might call them smart people, because they're the people who get away with it. They get to increase their well-being at the expense of others, and they actually get away with it. Because remember, the idea of cosmic justice is that you never get away with it. If there is no cosmic justice, and that cosmic justice could be like, you could even say something like, your moral sentiments never let you get away with it. You know what I'm saying? You could make that case. You could say that inherent in our moral sentiments is sort of a natural cosmic justice, right? Just that you will always feel worse for doing the thing that's bad than for doing the thing that's good, right? A person can make that case. I don't believe it. I believe that Stalin or other people that have done horrible, horrible things, maybe not Stalin, he's not a great example, but I think there's plenty of people who have done horrible, horrible things, and they died with a big fat smile on their face.
I agree. That has happened, right?
And the thing is,
to me, that's unfortunate, but it's reality. Right?
You're right. And that reality would say, though, that it changes the moral calculus, because at the end of the day, if I can die with a big fat smile on my face, and that is the ultimate sort of goal, is to be satisfied with your life at the highest degree that you can, and I can take advantage of other people and enslave other people, and if I have the power to do it, because see, talking about the power thing, power is just, if you have enough power, you can get away with it. And so life really becomes about power. You only have to negotiate and play nice with others to the degree that you don't have enough power. And what you're doing with other people in your interactions is you're trying to maximize the power you have in order to get what you want. You see what I'm saying? And so, again, it just boils back down. Every time I try, what I'm trying to do is, how do I, from an atheist point of view, avoid Foucault and avoid Nietzsche? Because when I follow them to their conclusions, everything in the world is arbitrary power battles.
Right. And that's why I'm encouraging you to read some other guys.
Yeah, no. And I guess in these last few minutes that we have, what would you say is the most compelling thing that you've heard that keeps you from going down that route?
From becoming like an immoral person who's just trying to get away with stuff?
No, not even that. Like, do you think it's right to view the world fundamentally as a network of groups engaged in power struggle?
I think there is I think you can view it through that. And I think that there is a reasonable approach to view it through, all these different groups and people and organizations fighting and competing for power. Very Foucauldian, right? But I don't think that's the entire answer, right? I think that we also have some basic fundamentals about who we are as humans, who we are as people. And that's why I'm going back to this moral sentiments idea that's baked into us as humans. And so I think that gets forgotten about quite often when you're talking about the is-ought problem, where you're talking, Sam Harris and the moral landscape. He never really even crosses that bridge himself to say, well, what do we base all this in? And I'm like, well, why don't we just do what Hume did and say it's in our moral sentiments? Where the moral sentiments come from? Oh, they're part of our tribal nature, right?
So let me kind of steelman that for a minute. So you're saying that there are these power dynamics that exist, but we can't escape the fact that you're going to feel bad for doing certain things. These moral sentiments will convict you that there is maybe in some sense a level of cosmic justice to where you won't feel right doing these bad things.
For most people, yes, but there will be some, psychopaths. There will be defectors. There will be always in any society people who try and get away with it. We'll call them criminals, right? They're the people who are trying to break the laws and get away with what the rest of us as a society through consensus have said, we're not going to steal from each other in our society because it's bad for us, right? We agree that that's generally something we're not going to do. But if somebody steals, they're a criminal. Right?
So and Foucault would say that those moral sentiments are primarily influenced by discourse, and meaning basically socialization. But he would say, if I were kind of channeling his point of view, he'd say, Troy, where do you think you got your moral sentiments from? About this much of it was maybe from your natural, evolutionary psychology, but the vast majority of it was based on the power structures of the culture and the discourse that you've been ensconced in your entire life that has shaped what you think is right and wrong. And in fact, I would say if you really took all that away and you just went down to the moral sentiments that you have, your morality would be far different than who you are today, which means the majority of your moral sentiments are basically social constructions and aren't really rooted in anything more than power and preference.
Right. And so that's a hypothesis, right? That's a hypothesis that's saying moral sentiments are mostly cultural and only small amount, genetic or biological. That would be your hypothesis there. And I would say there's evidence that points to the contrary. There are several books where they've done studies where they bring people in and they have, various tests that they do on moral features, and they discover a lot of consistency across different groups and organizations, different cultures, different societies, right? Like I served my mission to Korea, right? Korea is quite a different culture, but they still have a lot of the same sort of emotional sentiments that we have in the West, even though they're not baked in from Christianity, right? They still have empathy and compassion. They still have laws about morals.
But how much of that? I mean, I have a very hard time dealing with our modern world and not saying that our entire modern world has not been deeply influenced by Christianity and the spread of it throughout the social structures since the Enlightenment, which spread throughout the world. Like you'll notice that in Korea, they have a parliament. You know what I mean? They right. Which came from the English and the whole thing. And so I look at a much broader thing of human history, and I say that the last 300 years we've been living in is a weird little anomaly in human history, to where most of human history, and not only that, it's a weird anomaly that we can trace back to the Enlightenment's influence on the world, which again, I believe came from Christianity. And if we go back behind that, all of this stuff disappears. Everyone's moral sentiments all over the world were essentially tribal. And so I tend to, I don't know. I mean, I guess we go back and forth on the nature of the moral sentiments, but
yeah. And I would point you to China and India, right? Where they've got different organizations, but they much more populous, right? There's a billion people in China, a billion people in India. So you've got, Hindu and Buddhism, both predate Christianity by a long way, thousands of years. And they have their own moral codes and things about what they do, which are very similar, right?
And I do want to clarify this to anyone who's listening. I'm not saying that Christianity invented morality. Okay, I believe that there are moral truths, and that Christianity has done an excellent job of discovering and propagating moral truths. But I also believe that other religions and secular people and everything, that they can discover and propagate moral truths as well. I just want to make sure that, just because I don't care if an idea is Christian or non-Christian or whatever, I care, is it true? Right. And so I think that there's a lot to begin there. Now, we are kind of wrapping up here in the last few minutes. Hayden, I'm sorry I've taken a lot of this, but I want to give you some final questions here, and then we'll wrap it up.
I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed kind of the back and forth. And Troy, I just want to say thank you. I know that we're kind of wrapping up here, for coming on and being willing. Not many people I've talked to, especially who disagree with Jacob Hansen, are willing to come on his podcast and kind of spar with him, which you've done, and we appreciate that. Know that you're coming on here is appreciated. I do have one question, and just to kind of finalize it in my mind, and there's obviously more study to be done. I'm thinking about moral wrongs that us three, and I think most people in the world, abhor. And I'm talking about like rape, and I'm talking about, the torturing of children and those things.
That's universal, right? Every right. Culture hates that stuff, right?
Right. And so my question for you is, are you saying that morality is so subjective that there could be a situation where rape or torturing a child could be considered moral? Not that it would be likely, but is it even a possibility?
I would say possibly. Yeah. I mean, you're asking for possibilities. There's the consequentialist side of this, right? Where you start looking at what would the results be. And I could see one of those weird situations where, they're going to nuke the city if you don't do this awful thing to this girl or something. And there might be a case, consequentialist, where you'd have to say, all right, I'll kill the girl so he doesn't nuke the city, or some crazy, mad scientist thing. But in most cases, that's not going to happen, right? In most cases, you won't have this consequentialist craziness where you have to weigh things like that. The thing is moral philosophy is difficult, right? It's not easy. You have to work and try and figure out what makes things better. And that's why I think it's important to have discussions like this. And that's why I also think it's important to be talking, non-religious like myself, atheists, with folks like yourself, because we both agree on one thing that like Foucault and those guys do not. We believe in objective truth, right? We believe that you can figure it out, and whatever it is, it's independent from us. But if you go to like Foucault, there is no objective truth, if I understand it right, that it's all just, a narrative. It's all just the stories that we've told ourselves. And so I disagree with that viewpoint. And that viewpoint actually starts to undercut science, because science is based on the idea of objective truth and that you can somehow have some confidence in discovering it. So I see, this kind of postmodern, neo-Marxist sort of stuff that you see coming out of that direction as antithetical to the Enlightenment values, to, kind of the classical liberal atheist values even. And so that's why we're in opposition to some of those guys who are also considered atheists, right? So that's why you'll see like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins on one side, but, Foucault or, Marx or whatever on some other side.
Yeah. So you gave the example of the nuke. So can I give you one more analogy? And again, this is just a hypothetical, and I'm trying to just wrap my head around the idea that morality is subjective, as I think many atheists would suggest, right? Let's say that, I'm on an airplane or a boat or something, and I get stranded with a woman, right? And I'm a man. If morality is what's best for the group, or for the continuance of my genes, does morality say that I am justified in forcing myself upon this woman against her will in order to populate, right? If there's no hope for rescue and we want to start this new civilization, but she doesn't want to, am I obligated to force myself upon her? Does that make sense? Like, where does atheism naturally take us into what is moral and what is not? Does that make sense? Because Christianity would say you do not have a right to force yourself upon her, even if you're.
So I'm having trouble with the connection, guys.
Okay, everybody. So we are back. We had a little technical difficulty there, but we are back in action. So Hayden, let's just start back from, you were asking a question to Troy, and this will be kind of our final question, and then we'll wrap up. And I believe it had to do with a man and a woman on an island, or on a planet, let's say, and they're the only two people.
So just kind of the idea is, are there actions that are objective? I don't know if you do use the word objectively, but universally wrong. And you kind of hinted that there could be situations where not, whether, if I'm forced by somebody to do something to save a larger group of people, the nuclear bomb or whatever. But the scenario is, long story short, I'm trapped on an island with no hope of survival with a female. And if morality is what is best for the group and even best for me, then can I call it moral to force myself sexually upon this woman against her will, if that means that we can further our species in this little hypothetical? And I realize that hypotheticals only go so far, but I'm trying to understand if atheism, or this idea of this non-religious, non-God related morality leads to, well, whatever your answer is. How would you deal with that situation?
Yeah, so you're asking another situational question, a very hypothetical. For me personally, I would not, right? Because I have to go to my moral sentiments and go, I can't envision myself being able to overcome that non-aggression principle, which is, pretty dug into me from my culture and history, right? I would personally go, I couldn't conceive of myself forcing myself on somebody else, no matter how dire the situation is.
So it would be morally wrong. Would you label that morally wrong to do that on that island?
I would, because of the lack of consent, right? But that's because I personally, in my own, moral view of the universe, is that I put the rights with the individual, and consent is extremely important. Non-aggression is extremely important.
Would you say then that is that you wouldn't necessarily say, you'd say that's your preference? Because there's a difference to say it's immoral versus it's something that you don't prefer. Because to say that it is immoral to do that would be to say that it is like that people have an obligation not to do that thing,
or that it's objective. It's an objective standard for everybody. So my next question is, what if I had a different view, right? What if I didn't agree with you on the principle of aggression, and I just said, no, like, this is what we need to do in order to further our species. So I'm going to do this, and it's going to be moral. Like, do you have any issues with that?
Well, I guess my question would be this, Hayden, maybe this is the way to frame it. Yeah. Is there a way to adjudicate if Hayden thinks I should do this and you say I shouldn't do this, is there a right answer to that question?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because now we're getting into very, difficult situations where you're going to have to look at the situation specifically. I would have a difficult time saying, I know that this is absolutely right, or I know that this is absolutely wrong, because I don't believe in absolute morality that exists independent of the situation and the people involved.
Well, but in that situation, is there a right answer at all? And that's the more sort of meta question that I want to ask, that I think is at some of the root of a lot of this is it just arbitrary choice, or is there actually a standard by which we can say that this is right and this is wrong? Is that standard, as you had implied earlier, the flourishing of human life?
Yeah, but the individual, right? I'm going to go to the individual. I think maybe because I talked about we grew up or evolved in tribal society, that it was all about the collective, and I'm sorry if I've said that it's all about collective, or giving you that impression that it is. I think that the focus on the individual, because the individual is the smallest minority, right? It's where we build our society from. So the rights have to exist at the individual level and build from it in the moral framework that I believe most satisfies the need for well-being. So my response to that is like, no, you would not do it. But we are getting into deontological stuff right now. I'm starting to say it's your duty not to do it because of the notion of well-being for others, because I have adopted a moral principle. So I recognize that there's a chain that I have adopted along the way. If I had grown up in a different society Like if I had grown up somewhere else, say I had grown up in the 6th century or something, right? I might have a completely different view, and I recognize that.
Okay.
So I don't believe in like a universal, like morality that applies at all times in all situations, a cosmic justice. I don't think that happens. It's situational.
Sounds good. All righty. Well,
hey, before
Troy,
you guys go, I want to ask you a question.
Yeah, that's fine.
It came to me. So you were talking about how in the LDS worldview that God actually is has to align himself with moral principles that pre-exist God. Is that correct?
Yes.
So Alma 42:22, right?
Yep.
Or
That's
God would cease to be God.
Yep.
So where do those moral sentiments come from, if not from God?
So I would say that they're eternal, that they're just inherent in the fabric of eternal reality.
It's kind of like asking a scientist, where did gravity come from? It's like, what do you mean? Like, it's just there, right? No one created it. It's I don't know. I mean, how do you say it? How would you explain that?
Existence.
Yeah. It's just part of reality.
And we would, and the way I see it within the LDS sort of theology is along the lines of that is what when we talk about eternal law, we talk about like what the even God is subject to. That's just like the nature of reality itself. Like 2 + 2 = 4. That just is the way things are, right? And so, and maybe that's even a bad example. You probably cut that philosophically in some different ways. But my point, though, is that there are things that just are and always have been and always will be because they're baked into the eternal reality that we just inhabit.
Not baked in as if someone put them there, but they are there.
Yeah.
Right. So it sounds to me like you may run into a problem if you're talking to your Christian friends who would say, well, no, the source of morality is God. It's divine command theory. And you're saying, we disagree with you.
And I reject divine command theory on the same grounds that you do, probably. And there are lots. You won't find a bigger hater of divine command theory than me. So for multiple reasons. So that's an area where I think we can agree on.
Does that answer your question, though, or do you feel like we understood it?
Well, I just wanted to point out that, even within Christianity, you guys have a division, even with people with whom you are close, about the nature of morals and where morals come
absolutely.
from, right? It's not like it's all nice and clean. Yeah, you've got the same problems when you believe in God.
Philosophy, and I would even say within the church, a lot of us, like I've found an incredible amount of ignorance about it. And even my own viewpoints, I'm fine with people will disagree with my viewpoints on the way I formulate my moral philosophy within a Latter-day Saint context. So I'm not saying that I have it like I'm this is the kosher, everyone thinks like this within the church. Like definitely not. I think I have a really good argument and I would debate people, but that's that. Hey, everyone. Looks like we actually lost Troy on the connection there. We haven't been able to get him back on, but had a great discussion with him. Hayden, what did you think of the discussion?
I thought it was great. I thought, like I told him, it was great that he was even willing to come on in the first place. Really, really well thought out and good guy. And I thought it was excellent. I actually learned a lot.
Yeah. And let this be a lesson to all of you who disagree with us. Feel free to, let us know that you want to come on, tell us why we're wrong, and we're happy to chat more with you. So anyway, that will wrap it up for this episode. Thanks everyone for joining us. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and hit the subscribe button. Also, if you want more content, including the podcast, go to thoughtful-faith.com. Thanks for watching.